All right, welcome everyone to the talk about SQL Resurgence. We are going to unleash more data potential with dbt. If you look a bit back about the last 5 years, something like that, how do you transform data today? There are mainly 3 different categories. We distinguish programming languages like Python, Scala, these kinds of things. The advantage there is that we can do cool things for software engineering best practices. We can use Git for version controlling. It's very easy to maintain them, they're very powerful. However, if you want to learn something like Spark, especially with Scala, like the book, The Definitive Guide to Spark is this thick or something like that, it's very complex. And the disadvantage there a bit is that, well, you see that we have very technical experts, like data engineers often, who can transform the data, but they don't always know what the data is about. And then the people, the business folks who like to work with the data and understand data, they're not that technical. So we have some kind of boundary between the technical people and then the less technical people. And the problem is that people who work with the data are then the more technical people. We can also transform data with declarative languages, like we have SQL, we have SAS, these kinds of things. The advantage, like everyone can basically understand it, like lots of people can read and understand SQL, but it's not as flexible. We can't easily put these things in version control, in Git and so on. To make it even more accessible, we could use something like low-code or UI-based tooling, like drag and drop, where you put these boxes and arrows and so on to transform your data. These kinds of things are very powerful. It make it accessible to everyone, but the big disadvantage, of course, is that they're limited in terms of what you can do, because the vendor decides what you can do, and you also have a big vendor lock-in. If you use a tool there, and often you can't easily migrate to something else. So I do a quick survey. Usually at meetups where I speak, I organize a Belgium DBT meetup. I talk a lot of about Microsoft technologies as well, like you heard in the intro. And DBT is something I'm very passionate about, so I usually ask the audience some questions about what do you know about data transformations. And there are some statements that you can see on the screen, like people that answer them are usually active in data, and you see most of them actually say that they know SQL, and they also think that most other people also know SQL working in data. What they do say is that they don't think that most people can transform data with Spark, and especially with Scala in Spark or something like that. And they think SQL is very easy to learn, but it's not that flexible. So yeah, we have to do something about this, of course. Then Stack Overflow, the website that was popular before we had ChatGPT. When you had to look up something, you went to Stack Overflow. They also do surveys every year. And then in 2023, they also did a survey. And if you look a bit at the graph here, you see lines going from technologies you work with and then technologies you want to work with. So it's mainly in software development or data and so on. And SQL actually has a very big part of the graph. You see, for example, HTML and CSS also have a very close relationship, but actually most people working in software work with SQL as well, or at least people working with SQL also touch these other things as well. Then if you look at tools that you might know from your day-to-day job, when you transform data, you have different kinds of ways to approach it. You have, for example, for BI, you have Tableau, Click, or things like Power BI and these kinds of things for analysis. What you see is there's not drag and drop in common on all of them. What you do have in common in all of these tools, they all support SQL. So I think SQL is really rising again as the tool for data transformations, but you have to fix these shortcomings. Like, how do we make it more flexible? How do we version control our code? How do we test our code, make it easy to maintain these kinds of things? This is where DBT comes in. DBT is the T in ELT. So if you load your data in your data warehouse, the data is there. Then next step is transforming your data. Well, this is where DBT comes in. DBT helps you with transforming the data. It does not help you with loading the data or extracting it from something. Really focuses on the transformations itself and does that with SQL. DBT is gaining in popularity every year. DBT Labs, the company who builds DBT, it's an open source product, but there's also a company backing it a lot. They do a conference, DBT Coalesce, is actually now in a few weeks again. And Tristan Henny, the CEO of DBT Labs, published this graph last year at the conference. No, it's not a good graph because it doesn't have a good axis to the side, but yeah, let's ignore that for a bit. And what you see is really gaining in popularity like the last few years. DBT started in 2016 as the first commit was made on GitHub by the founder, Drew Bannon. And then we see popularity rising, especially during the pandemic, because people were at home. They thought, maybe let's look at some new technologies, and they found DBT and fell in love with it. That's what happened to me as well. This is a graph showing weekly active projects. I also did a workshop yesterday. Someone asked, why is there a dip each year? It's Christmas. So if you don't work during Christmas, then it's not going to count as an active project. If you go home today and you want to remember 3 things about DBT, DBT does not provide the compute capacity. So it needs a data warehouse or a cluster or something to do the actual computation. It's actually a basic, well, not a basic tool, but quite simple in how it does its work. It's just send SQL queries to your data warehouse or to your computation cluster. DBT can make your SQL more powerful with Jinja. It's basically SQL on steroids. And there are 2 versions of DBT. There's a DBT core version, which is open source, free to use. You can do with it whatever you want. And you have the cloud version. There's also a free tier, but usually people start paying per user per month and so on. So the DBT core experience is complete. You have everything that you need to work with DBT in there. You don't need anything else, basically, to get started with DBT itself. But DBT Cloud then makes it a bit easier to work with DBT. Like what I have in there is like the IDE in the browser is there. You don't have to set up VS Code and install extensions and configure and install DBT, these kinds of things. Quite easy to get started. They have job scheduling. So if you're used to use something like Airflow or Dexter or Prefect, these kinds of things, DBT Cloud also has this built in. So if you don't have these kinds of things, then don't worry, you can use DBT Cloud for that. They also host your data documentation. We'll see later what data documentation is. But basically, it just makes it easier to get started. And usually, well, I work with tons of customers who use DBT. We recommend to use DBT Core if they really are very strong in engineering and they can do everything themselves and so on. But DBT Cloud for smaller teams, they don't want to focus on the engineering work. They just want to get it done and just work with the data. Now, if you're using a data warehouse today, you might see yours on the list here. DBT is compatible with lots of different database engines. You can use it with Snowflake, with Databricks, BigQuery, and this is not even a full list. It's only a small part of it. And this is also one of the nice things that I like about DBT. It has a great open community. Everyone can contribute. Everyone can even extend the support. I, for example, am in the DBT community quite active. I do the maintenance on the first row on all of these adapters. That's things that I built. But lots of them are also supported officially by the companies behind it and so on. So if you're seeing your data warehouse on there, you can get started with DBT today. How do you get started then? Well, basically 2 ways. The DBT Cloud way, you go to cloud.getdbt.com, you sign up for a new account, and you create a new project. It will ask you to provide credentials to connect to your data warehouse, like the host name, username, password, these kinds of things. And then when you fill it in, you just create a new project and you can get started. That's it. With DBT Core, if you want to just start developing locally, also quite easy to do. It's only the extra things that you add on top, like scheduling, that takes more time to set up. You just install the Python package that you need for your data warehouse, and then you're off to the races. So for example, if you work with Snowflake, do pip install dbt Snowflake, then installs dbt on your machine. You use dbt init to create a new project, and then it already gives you some example models, and then you can do a dbt run to run your first dbt model transformations. What are these models? So dbt is quite popular because it's really bringing the best practices of software engineering into the world of analytics. We also have this practice now that we call analytics engineering. You also saw it during the intro from Data Makers Fest. This is really becoming the new popular job role, let's say, in the data practitioners world, where we have the overlap between the data engineers who are very technical, but they focus more on the platform building and so on. And then we also have the data analysts. They're not super technical. They focus on working with the data, transforming it, making it consumable, building data products. the Venn diagram, the overlap between the two, that's analytics engineering. These people really focus on transforming the data. They're a bit more technical. They know things like hits, CI/CD, terminal usage. They want to work with pull requests to really make sure their code is like it should be. People can review each other's code, they write tests and so on. That's a bit of overlap. And modular development with dbt is quite easy to do because everything is in separate files, so you can version control them. You can see the history of those files. You can use Jinja, for example, here on the example, you have a for loop. For example, here if I have an example where I have a shop, and the shop wants to categorize things in what I sell. And the amount of categories here, food and drink at this moment, can be more, can be less at some point in time. And I want to have a summary for each of the categories. So then what I do a for loop over the categories in this Jinja code. And then I put my SQL code that I want to repeat inside. And then dbt will send it to the data warehouse, the compiled version of this, which then only has a SQL code. Your data warehouse reads it and executes the query. And then the result of your select statement becomes a table or a view in your data warehouse. That's basically how dbt works. Every transformation is a model, and every model is a select statement. You can really customize all of this, parameterize this, go crazy with how you want to make this flexible. They have all kinds of Jinja functions that you can use to really take it to the next level, to modularize your code and adopt the dry principle. So don't repeat yourself. They also have something called macros that you can use to build some kind of functions like in other programming languages to then make sure that you can reuse these things in different model transformations. To get started with talking to your data with dbt, you configure a source. Your sources are defined in YAML files. dbt always works a combination of YAML files and SQL files. So you have SQL for the transformations themselves, and then we have the YAML files for everything that goes with it. And how you structure them is a bit up to you. They're very flexible, but they also come with lots of conventions to make it easier to get started for new people to onboard on a project and so on. So here I define my source. I have e-commerce data. I told dbt my data is located in a schema called raw, and then I have a few tables in there which contain the data I want to work with in dbt. You already see here freshness. It means that I can already start monitoring the quality of my data. In this case, how fresh is my data? Did the data load process actually happen? Here it will give me a warning if my data is older than 24 hours. This allows you to make it very dynamic again. So if you work with a data warehouse that has multiple schemas for production, for development, acceptance, testing, whatever, you can make this flexible because in dbt you define the schema in this YAML file. You can even make this again, parameterize it with environment variables, these kinds of things. And in your SQL code, you use this Jinja to reference a source, the name that you saw in the previous YAML file, and that way dbt will replace it during the execution time with the right name of your table. We have data lineage in dbt as well. This is really one of the more powerful features in dbt. Like most customers that I give a demo to on dbt, they're really convinced by this feature. This is the one that they're really most excited about. Because if you have a big data project, how do you know where your dimensional facts, where the data is coming from? Like after a few months, you still remember, but like after a few years, people start leaving the team, joining the team. Nobody knows how your data is flowing throughout the platform, unless you dive into the code and try to find out what it does and so on, but nobody likes to do this. So data lineage can show you how data flows throughout your project. You can also spot bad designs, so it's not that with dbt that your project is also always beautiful. You still have to think about data modeling. And data lineage then helps you to visualize it so that you can see these are the pain points of a project as well. Then data testing is also something really cool in dbt. We also, since the last version, have unit testing. Here we can define tests to monitor the quality of our data. It's a good step up if you don't have data quality monitoring today, then this is already very powerful. You can even take this further with other tools, of course. You define your tests in either YAML or SQL. They're very simple to define. Like, for example, you say, don't want this column to be null, or it has to be unique always. And these kinds of things can dbt run if you run a dbt test command, and it will show you if the test passed or failed. These tests are defined, and like I said, often in SQL or in YAML files. And next to the test, you can also write your documentation. So in the documentation part, for example, here, if you ask someone, what is a customer, people say it's someone who bought something. Someone else says it's someone who we're considering to have as a customer, or who is a lead or something. The definition is different depending on what you ask in a company. This can make it clear, because the table customers now, as you can see, is someone who bought at least one item, then they're a customer. And then I can add tests. For example, here I want to check if my amount of calculations on the money and so on is right, with taxes and so on. These kinds of things you can define in those YAML files. It's a good way to create a documentation in YAML, a good step up to a data catalog, because then it's becoming visual. You have dbt docs, which are then generated, where you can see all the columns you have, the data types, the documentation you have, the tests that you have defined. If you use dbt Cloud, it even shows you the results of your test and so on. It's really easy to use and browse to whatever you've built. You can check, okay, does this already exist? I'm looking for data about customers. You'll find the customers model. Then, of course, with all the openness, you get extra advantages with dbt. So dbt packages is a great thing that they have, where you can really put the macros and models, the tests that you frequently use in multiple projects in a separate package, and then distribute it throughout your company. So if you use something like a data mesh approach or something like that, you can build a central package that has all the things you want to share, and then everyone can reuse it just by installing the package. It also helps you, for example, Snowplow is a popular analytics framework. If you have Snowplow tracking and you want to work with Snowplow, Snowplow already has dbt packages. So you just plug those packages into your project, and it already has the documentation on their tables and so on that they generate, the tests even on their table, and these kinds of things that helps you get started. For example, here I'm building a date dimension. If you want to work with dimensions and facts, then date dimension is something people often use. Often, this is like a lot of complex logic to build a date dimension. Here, basically, line 4 is the only line I need. The other one is just to get the current year to build my date dimension. And boom, I have a table with like 20 columns with more information about the date that I want to do aggregations on. Now, I covered a few main features of dbt, but there's lots more, and dbt is also still on a very active development. You can do SCD, so changing dimensions, to check history with snapshots in dbt, where it then says, okay, this was the version of your data at this point in time. You can always go back in time and keep track of something. Maybe your source doesn't provide this last update date or these kinds of history information. Then you can do this with dbt. You also don't have to load all of your data all the time. dbt supports incremental loading of your data. So with incremental loads, you can say, I only want to transform the rows which are changed since the last time I ran dbt. They also have other things to integrate. They have hooks and operations. And then even for the people who really felt like, I don't want to use SQL, I may want to use Python still for lots of things or something like that, you can still use Python inside dbt for some data warehouses, like BigQuery supports it, Databricks supports it, Snowflake supports it. And then with these data warehouses, you can still run Python inside dbt as well. And it integrates seamlessly with the SQL models. So there is no difference from the point of view, from the documentation, from the tests and so on. They're native models like the other ones. You can manage access to the data with grants in dbt. You can track how your data is used with exposures, like which dashboards are consuming your data, these kinds of things. And then one of the newer features is also data contracts. It's also one of the newer hypes in the data world, that data contracts, if you haven't heard about this, is to specify how your data, what it looks like, and then it's going to adhere to a certain contract, and everyone consuming your data is going to have a guarantee that, okay, this data is always going to follow that contract. The contract can specify the data types, it can specify the names of the columns, it can specify maybe a bit about the quality about your data as well. These kinds of things you can also do with dbt. So I hope it was a good getting started on like what can you do with dbt, how can you use it. So basically, if you want to work with your data and you want to make your transformations with SQL, then version controlled and reproducible, then dbt is there for you. The built-in documentation lineage is very powerful because it provides more information about what you've already built, and then you can easily make this visible to the consumers of your data. You can test both your code and your data. They now also have unit tests for your code as well. And it's very modular and easy to use. Your next steps, so if you think, okay, this was interesting, what can I do now? There's a huge community, like we have 100,000 members in the DBT community on Slack, where there's lots of channels. You have local channels specifically from your region, and they organize meetups that you can attend to. Like I do the ones in Belgium, and I usually have like lots of interested people in there. You can go to learn.getdbt.com to get started and take a free course on getting started with DBT. And yeah, talk to more people in the community because they're super helpful. They're really interesting in helping beginners and so on. It's very open. It's also what really interested me in DBT. I hope you found this interesting. If you have some questions, I'm still here the whole day. You can find me walking around. And thank you for your attention.